The ground trembled beneath the Xylos Prime research outpost, another minor seismic event that would barely register in the daily logs. To the humans stationed here, these tremors were merely an occupational hazard, a minor inconvenience in their pursuit of knowledge about this geologically hyperactive planet. To the Cthar, however, each tremor was a source of profound anxiety, their naturally fragile physiology ill-suited to such violent disruptions. Dr. Eris Thorne felt the tremor intensify as she descended into the lower maintenance shaft. The critical atmospheric regulator had been malfunctioning for days, its efficiency dropping at an alarming rate. With the next supply ship still 3 weeks away, repair rather than replacement was the only option. As the station's senior geologist and one of the few human technicians with experience in the harsh environments of outer rim planets, Eris was the natural choice for the job. Secondary cooling system is offline completely now, she muttered to herself, sliding deeper into the narrow shaft. Her environmental suit's sensors showed the temperature rising steadily around the regulator's core. If it failed entirely, the outpost's delicate equilibrium would be compromised within hours. Command, I'm approaching the main junction now. Readings confirm primary coolant leak and possible structural damage to the inner housing. Station Commander Zoran's voice crackled through her comms, the characteristic high pitch of Cthar's speech distorted further by interference. Proceed with extreme caution, Dr. Thorne. Our readings indicate increasing seismic activity in your sector. Perhaps we should evacuate the area until— Not an option, Eris interrupted, already removing the protective panel that housed the regulator's control unit. If we don't stabilize this system now, we risk catastrophic failure. She didn't bother adding what they both knew. The Cthar inhabitants of the station would be the first to suffer if environmental controls failed. Their species required precise atmospheric conditions that humans could survive without for much longer. The tremor intensified suddenly, shaking the maintenance shaft violently. Eris braced herself against the nearest support beam, tools clutched tightly in her gloved hands. A series of warning lights flashed across her helmet display, indicating structural integrity issues in the shaft itself. Dr. Thorne, you must evacuate immediately. Commander Zoran's voice was more urgent now. Sensors indicate imminent collapse in your section. Eris ignored the warning, focusing instead on the exposed regulator components. She was close, just a few moments more, and she could bypass the damaged section, reroute the coolant flow. Just as her fingers connected the final emergency coupling, the outpost shuddered with the strongest tremor yet. The maintenance shaft groaned ominously. Eris looked up just in time to see a massive support strut tear free from the ceiling. She tried to roll away, but in the confined space, there was nowhere to go. The metal beam crashed down, catching her left arm and shoulder in its descent, pinning her against the hard floor of the shaft. White-hot pain exploded through her body as the crushing weight bore down. She felt something crack beneath the pressure, bone giving way with sickening ease. The suit's integrity alarm blared in her ears, indicating breaches in multiple sections. Through the haze of pain, she noted with professional detachment that at least the regulator was now functioning again, its status lights returning to a stable green. Status report, Dr. Thorne. Commander Zoran's voice seemed distant now, competing with the ringing in her ears. Eris tried to move, discovered she couldn't. The beam had her thoroughly trapped, and the pain suggested significant damage beneath her suit. She took a careful breath, noting the sharp stab in her chest that likely indicated broken ribs. Minor setback, she managed through gritted teeth. Regulator is back online, but I'm temporarily immobilized. Her suit sensors blinked ominously, internal diagnostics reporting rapidly dropping blood pressure and increasing heart rate. The physical damage assessment flashed red across her visor. Multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding, traumatic tissue compression. She tried to reach for her emergency medkit with her free hand, but it was just beyond her grasp. Sensors indicate severe physical trauma. Zoran's voice had taken on the high-pitched quality that signaled Cthar distress. Medical team dispatched. Remain still and conserve oxygen. Eris couldn't help but smile grimly at that. Remaining still wasn't exactly optional at the moment. She focused on her breathing, attempting to manage the pain through the techniques she'd learned during her decade on frontier worlds. The outpost's automatic medical alert must have already dispatched the on-duty medical officer to her. Location. She just had to hold on until then. Minutes passed that felt like hours. The shaft had stabilized, the tremors subsiding to occasional shivers. Eris drifted in and out of awareness, the pain becoming a constant companion rather than an acute sensation. She was vaguely aware of voices and movement at the entrance to the shaft, the sound of cutting tools working through the debris that must have collapsed behind her. The first face she saw clearly belonged to Lyra, the station's Kthar medical officer. The slender alien moved with extraordinary grace even in the confined space, her six-fingered hands already operating a portable medical scanner that hummed softly as it passed over Eris's trapped form. Dr. Thorne, please remain still while I assess your condition. Lyra's large, iridescent eyes widened dramatically as she viewed the scanner's results, her normally pale blue skin taking on the deeper indigo hue that indicated extreme distress in her species. This is catastrophic. Multiple compound fractures, severe internal hemorrhaging, organ displacement, nerve damage. How are you even conscious? Eris tried to shrug, immediately regretted the movement as pain lanced through her chest. It's hardly bleeding, she replied, nodding toward where the beam pinned her arm. Indeed, there was surprisingly little visible blood, though her suit was torn and crushed inward at alarming angles. Lyra's facial tendrils vibrated with agitation. The external bleeding is minimal only because the compression is acting as a natural tourniquet. The internal damage is horrific. She was already unpacking a sophisticated medical kit, preparing what looked like an emergency stasis field generator. We need immediate extraction and full medical protocols. Your physiology is experiencing traumatic shock cascade. Just get this beam off me, and I can walk out, Eris insisted, though she knew it wasn't true. The pain was becoming harder to compartmentalize, darkness encroaching at the edges of her vision. The regulator is functional again. That's what matters. Lyra paused in her preparations, her large eyes blinking in what Eris had learned was an expression of profound Kthar confusion. Your biological integrity is severely compromised. The equipment is irrelevant in comparison. The equipment, Eris managed through a cough that tasted metallically of blood, keeps everyone alive. Just patch me up enough to supervise the remaining repairs. 2 more Kthar technicians had arrived now, bearing sophisticated cutting equipment designed to remove the beam without causing further injury. Lyra directed them with precise movements, simultaneously administering what Eris recognized as a powerful painkiller and stabilizing agent through a breach in her suit. Absolutely not, Lyra replied firmly. You require immediate intensive reconstruction. I estimate at minimum 6 standard cycles of nanoregeneration and tissue cultivation before you could be cleared even for minor physical activity. Eris wanted to argue further, but the medication was taking effect, dulling her senses and making her thoughts swim hazily. As the Kthar rescue team carefully lifted the severed beam segment away from her body, she caught a glimpse of her arm and shoulder, a mangled mess of environmental suit material, blood, and visibly distorted flesh underneath. Something white protruded at an unnatural angle, undoubtedly bone. She managed, oddly detached from the sight. That'll need a stitch or 2. Lyra's vocal membranes vibrated with what might have been Kthar exasperation as the medical stasis field enveloped Eris's broken body. Your capacity for understatement is as baffling as it is concerning, Dr. Thorne. The last thing Eris remembered was the sensation of being lifted, the weightlessness of the medical stasis field, and Lyra's concerned face hovering above her, those large iridescent eyes blinking rapidly in the distinctive pattern that the Kthar displayed when deeply troubled. The medical bay of Xylos Prime Outpost was a marvel of xenobiological integration, designed to accommodate the varied physiologies of the dozen species that made up the research team. The Cthar section, where Lyra presided, was particularly advanced, a reflection of their species' medical expertise and their own fragile constitutions that required constant attention. Eris drifted back to consciousness slowly, awareness returning in fragments. The ceiling above her was the soft, pearlescent blue of Cthar medical facilities. The air carried the distinctive, sweet metallic scent of their regenerative technologies. And the pain? The pain was still there, but muted now, held at bay by what must have been a significant cocktail of medications. The patient has regained consciousness. Lyra's voice came from somewhere nearby. Neural patterns indicate awareness, though still compromised by trauma and medication. Eris turned her head slightly, finding the movement surprisingly difficult. Lyra stood at a control panel nearby, her slender form draped in the shimmering medical robes that indicated her senior status. Commander Zoran stood beside her, his more elaborate head tendrils marking him as an elder Cthar. "Can you understand me, Dr. Thorne?" Lyra approached, scanner in hand, her movements characteristically precise and measured. "Perfectly," Eris replied, her voice raspier than expected. "Status report on the regulator?" Lyra and Zoran exchanged a look that Eris had come to recognize as Cthar bewilderment, a slight vibration of their facial tendrils while their eyes blinked in asymmetrical patterns. "The atmospheric system is functioning at 82% capacity," Commander Zoran replied after a moment. "Your emergency repair was effective, if unconventional." "Good." Eris attempted to sit up, only to discover she was secured to the medical platform by a series of softly glowing restraint fields. "Is this really necessary?" "Absolutely," Lyra replied without hesitation, moving closer to adjust something on the biomonitor above Eris's bed. "Your injuries are severe and extensive. Any movement risks compromising the initial reconstruction protocols." "How bad?" Eris asked, attempting to assess her own condition. Her left arm and shoulder were encased in a translucent regeneration field, the limb itself barely recognizable beneath the technologies working to repair it. She could see similar fields across her torso and what appeared to be another around her left leg, though the sensation from these areas was significantly dulled. "By Cthar medical standards, catastrophic," Lyra said, her tone clinical but her eyes displaying the rapid, blinking pattern of distress. "Your skeletal structure sustained 17 distinct fractures. Your left humerus was completely shattered, with bone fragments damaging surrounding muscle tissue and severing both neural and vascular pathways. 3 ribs fractured, 1 penetrating your left lung. Significant crush damage to your left femur. Internal hemorrhaging in your abdominal cavity. Spleen rupture. Significant blood loss." "That explains the headache," Eris commented dryly. Lyra's facial tendrils stiffened in what Eris had learned was the Cthar equivalent of shock. Headache will be the least of your concerns. By Cthar physiological standards, these injuries would be fatal. The trauma would trigger cascading neurological shutdown within moments. "We're a bit sturdier," Eris replied, testing the restraint field with her right hand. It gave slightly, but remained firmly in place. "How long until I can return to duty?" This time, Commander Zoran intervened, his posture shifting to what Eris recognized as the formal stance of authority. "That will not be possible for a considerable period, Dr. Thorne. Medical Officer Lyra has submitted a detailed recovery protocol that indicates a minimum of 38 standard cycles before you could be cleared even for limited laboratory duties." 38 cycles. Eris couldn't keep the dismay from her voice. That was nearly 2 standard months. That's completely unacceptable. The geological survey of the northern basin needs to be completed before the heavy storm season begins, and that's less than 20 cycles away. "Your survey will be reassigned," Zoran stated firmly. "The primary concern now is your biological recovery. With all due respect, Commander, I've worked through worse than this." It wasn't entirely true, but Eris had certainly continued research with fractures and other injuries that would have confined Cthar to intensive care. "At least let me supervise remotely." The new technicians don't have the experience to identify the trace mineral deposits we're looking for. Absolutely not, Lyra interjected, her normally soft voice unusually firm. Your human physiology demonstrates remarkable resilience, but that does not mean recovery can be rushed. The nanoregeneration process requires carefully controlled conditions. Mental and emotional stress will compromise the healing matrix. She's right, Zoran added. I've issued a formal medical suspension of your duties, effective immediately and continuing until medical officer Lyra certifies you fit for return. Eris opened her mouth to protest further, but was interrupted by a sharp pain in her chest as she tried to draw a deeper breath. She winced, immediately drawing Lyra's attention. Pain response detected, the Cathar medical officer noted, already adjusting something on her control panel. I'm modifying your analgesic mixture. You must remain calm and still for the tissue integration to proceed optimally. I don't need more medication, Eris objected, though the pain was intensifying as the conversation continued. Just give me a basic stabilizer and some bandages. Humans have been patching themselves up with less for thousands of years. Barbaric, Lyra murmured, though she reduced whatever adjustment she had been making. Your historical medical practices explain much about human psychological patterns. She turned to Commander Zoran. I request privacy with my patient now. The initial regeneration cycle is at a critical phase, and emotional agitation is counterproductive. Zoran nodded, the movement sending ripples through his elaborate head tendrils. Keep me informed of any significant developments. He fixed Eris with a stare from his large, multifaceted eyes. Rest and recover, Dr. Thorne. That is an order. As the commander departed, Eris sighed, immediately regretting it as pain lanced through her chest again. You're overreacting, she told Lyra. A simple bone knitter for the worst fractures, some synthetic skin for the tears, and I could be back to light duty within a cycle. Lyra's facial tendrils vibrated in a pattern that Eris had come to recognize as the Cathar equivalent of exasperation. Your species' casual approach to physical trauma continues to astonish me. When I first scanned your injuries, I anticipated immediate organ failure. Yet you remained conscious and were more concerned with equipment than your own survival. Equipment can be harder to replace than flesh out here, Eris replied. She tried to shift position slightly, testing the limits of her mobility. The restraint field adjusted automatically, preventing any movement that might disrupt the healing technologies. How long am I going to be stuck in this bed? The initial intensive regeneration phase requires 7 cycles of complete immobility, Lyra replied, checking readings on a nearby display. After that, extremely limited movement will be possible while the secondary phase reconstructs your musculature and nervous pathways. 7 cycles? That's a week of doing nothing. Eris couldn't keep the horror from her voice. Enforced inactivity was her personal nightmare. 7 cycles of allowing your body to heal, Lyra corrected. It is the absolute minimum time required. For a Cathar with comparable injuries, not that a Cathar could survive such trauma, the immobility period would be at least 30 cycles. We don't heal the same way, Eris pointed out. Human recovery is actually accelerated by certain types of controlled movement and stress. So your medical database indicates, Lyra acknowledged. I have studied human physiology extensively since your arrival at the outpost. It is counterintuitive in many respects. However, the current damage is beyond what your natural healing capabilities can address without significant technological assistance. Eris wanted to argue further, but found her thoughts becoming increasingly sluggish. Despite her objections, Lyra had clearly adjusted her medication, and the powerful Cathar pharmaceuticals were taking effect. You should rest now, Lyra said, her voice sounding more distant. The first phase of neural reconnection will begin while you sleep. It is less distressing that way. Need to check the geological data, Eris mumbled, fighting against the encroaching darkness. The tremor patterns might indicate. The data will wait. Lyra's voice was the last thing Eris heard before consciousness slipped away entirely. You are the one constant in this outpost that I refuse to allow to break. Days passed in a haze of medication and healing procedures. Eris drifted in and out of consciousness, each waking period marked by Lyra's presence and her meticulous attention to every detail of the recovery process. The Cthar medical officer seemed fascinated and disturbed in equal measure by the way Eris's body responded to treatment, healing faster than Cthar physiology would allow, yet in what Lyra repeatedly described as alarmingly disorganized patterns. By the fourth cycle, Eris was fully conscious for longer periods and increasingly frustrated by her confinement. The restraint field had been modified to allow limited movement of her right arm, but the rest of her body remained essentially immobilized as the regenerative technologies continued their work. I need access to a data terminal, she insisted during Lyra's morning examination. I can at least review the seismic data while I'm stuck here. Mental exertion will divert resources from physical healing, Lyra replied, carefully adjusting the regenerative field around Eris's shattered left arm. The limb was now recognizable as an arm again, though still heavily encased in medical technology. Your brain requires significant energy to process your body's trauma. My brain is bored to the point of atrophy, Eris countered. Humans don't do well with inactivity. It's actually detrimental to our recovery. Lyra paused in her adjustments, her large eyes studying Eris with that particular blend of scientific curiosity and personal concern that characterized her approach to human patients. Your species continues to confound my understanding of biological imperatives. Most life forms instinctively conserve energy when injured. We're not most life forms, Eris replied with a slight smile. Our evolutionary path favored those who could keep moving despite injury. Predators tend to target the visibly wounded, so showing weakness wasn't a survival trait. Fascinating and somewhat disturbing, Lyra murmured. She made a notation on her medical tablet. I will permit limited data access, but only for short periods, and I will monitor your neural activity. Any sign of stress, and it will be discontinued immediately. Deal. Eris agreed quickly, before the Cthar could reconsider, and maybe reduce the sedative levels? I don't need to be kept half unconscious all the time. The sedatives are calibrated to optimize tissue regeneration and prevent pain response, Lyra pointed out, though she made another adjustment to her tablet. However, I will modify the formulation to allow greater mental clarity while maintaining physical comfort. I don't mind some discomfort if it means I can think straight, Eris said. Pain is useful information. Lyra's facial tendrils vibrated in that now familiar pattern of Cthar exasperation. Your species' relationship with pain is perhaps the most baffling aspect of your physiology. Pain is a warning system, not a status to be endured or ignored. Sometimes the warning isn't as important as what you're trying to accomplish, Eris replied simply. Like with the regulator. The pain of my injuries was less critical than preventing outpost-wide environmental failure. A perspective that remains alien to Cthar thought, Lyra said, completing her adjustments to the regeneration field. I will have a limited access data terminal brought to you, but I expect you to report any increase in pain levels immediately, not after you've completed whatever analysis you deem more important. Eris grinned. I'll try to remember. True to her word, Lyra arranged for a suspended data terminal that Eris could access with her free right hand. The geological data from the recent tremors proved fascinating, indicating a pattern of seismic activity that suggested larger movements in the planet's crust than previously recorded. Eris lost herself in the analysis, barely noticing the passing hours until Lyra returned and firmly deactivated the terminal. Your neural activity shows patterns consistent with obsessive focus and elevated stress hormones, the medical officer informed her. The exact opposite of the restful state conducive to healing. But I've identified a potential correlation between the magnetic field fluctuations and the tremor epicenters, Eris protested. This could help us predict the next major seismic event, which would be useful only if you recover sufficiently to implement whatever protective measures might be required, Lyra countered smoothly. Your human colleagues can continue this analysis while you heal. They don't have my specialized training in comparative planetology, Eris argued, though she knew it was a losing battle. The medication was being adjusted again. She could feel the subtle shift as her thoughts began to slow and the pain, which had indeed been increasing during her work, receded once more. You cannot transfer decades of expertise in a few data bursts, Lyra acknowledged. But neither can you accelerate biological healing beyond certain parameters, even with our most advanced technologies. Your human impatience is physiologically counterproductive. As the days passed, Lyra began to allow Eris progressively more freedom. First removing the restraint fields entirely, then permitting limited sitting up, and finally, after careful scanning and considerable reluctance, short periods of standing beside the medical platform. The Kthar medical officer watched these activities with a combination of scientific interest and what Eris had come to recognize as genuine concern. Your healing rate exceeds our projected models by approximately 22%, Lyra noted on the 10th day, reviewing scan results as Eris carefully flexed her partially regenerated left arm. The limb was still weak and surrounded by a lighter version of the regeneration field, but the improvement was remarkable. However, the cellular reconstruction shows concerning irregularities. Meaning what exactly? Eris asked, rotating her shoulder carefully and noting the points where pain flared more intensely. Your body appears to prioritize functional recovery over complete cellular alignment, Lyra explained, displaying a magnified image of Eris's healing bone structure. The fracture sites are connecting and strengthening rapidly, but with significant deviation from original formation patterns. It's as if your biology values expedient functionality over optimal restoration. That sounds about right, Eris agreed. We tend to heal quickly, but imperfectly. Scars, slight misalignments, that sort of thing. But this approach risks long-term structural weakness, Lyra objected, gesturing to highlighted areas in the scan. These irregular patterns will create points of vulnerability to future injury, which we compensate for by adjusting our movement patterns, strengthening surrounding tissues, or simply accepting the limitations, Eris explained. Perfect isn't always necessary. Functional is usually enough. Lyra's facial tendrils vibrated in what Eris now recognized as thoughtful consideration rather than distress. A pragmatic, biological compromise. Fascinating. She made additional notes on her tablet. Still, with our technology, we can guide the reconstruction toward more optimal patterns without significantly delaying your recovery. I'm all for that, Eris agreed. I'd rather not have my arm snap again the next time I need to lift something heavy. As Lyra adjusted the regeneration field settings, the medical bay's communication system activated. Commander Zoran's voice filled the room, the characteristic high pitch carrying a note of tension that immediately caught both their attention. Medical Officer Lyra, is Dr. Thorne conscious and able to advise on technical matters? Lyra glanced at Eris, who was already straightening, alert despite her condition. Yes, Commander, though she remains under intensive medical care and is not cleared for duty. We have a situation developing in the geothermal power core, Zoran continued. Chief Engineer Valance reports anomalous pressure readings that correlate with the seismic pattern Dr. Thorne was analyzing before her injury. We require her expertise immediately. I'll need a direct link to the core systems and real-time seismic monitoring, Eris said instantly, all thoughts of her injuries temporarily set aside. Lyra, can you set up the terminal for full data access? The patient is not cleared for active duty, Lyra protested, though she was already adjusting the medical platform to a more upright position. Any stress could disrupt the regeneration matrices. I don't need to be physically present, Eris argued. Just let me see the data and communicate with the engineering team. If this is what I think it is, we may have very little time. Zoran's voice came again, more urgent now. The pressure variances are increasing at an exponential rate. Chief Engineer Valance estimates critical threshold within 2 hours if the current trend continues. Lyra hesitated only briefly before activating the medical bays main display system, far larger and more sophisticated than the limited terminal Eris had been permitted previously. Linking to core systems now, she said, her fingers moving rapidly across the control interface. But I will monitor your vital signs continuously, Dr. Thorne. At the first sign of significant distress, I will intervene. Fair enough, Eris agreed, already focused on the incoming data streams. The numbers confirmed her worst fears. The pattern she had identified earlier was accelerating, indicating imminent geological activity directly beneath the outpost's primary power generation system. Put me through to Chief Engineer Valance, please. For the next hour, Eris directed the engineering team through emergency procedures to vent the excess pressure and reroute critical systems away from the threatened areas. Her voice remained steady, her instructions precise, despite the pain that increased as the sedative effects of her medication gradually diminished. Lyra watched silently from nearby, scanner in hand, her large eyes tracking both Eris's vital signs and the data flowing across the screens. When the crisis point finally passed, the pressure readings stabilizing and the immediate danger averted, Eris sank back against the medical platform, suddenly aware of the throbbing pain in her partially healed arm and the deep ache throughout her torso. The patient requires immediate rest and medication adjustment, Lyra announced, already moving to Eris's side with scanner raised. Her stress indicators are dangerously elevated, and the regeneration field has been compromised by muscle tension and elevated heart rate. The outpost is secure, Commander Zoran acknowledged. Excellent work, Dr. Thorne. We will implement your suggested long-term modifications to the geothermal tap design. As the communication ended, Lyra administered a new round of medication, her movements efficient but gentler than usual. That was both impressive and medically reckless, she said quietly, adjusting the regeneration field that had indeed shifted during Eris's period of intense focus. Your heart rate and stress hormones reached levels that would trigger systemic shutdown in Icthar, but prevented a potential catastrophic failure in the power core, Eris pointed out, already feeling the effects of the medication as it dulled the renewed pain. Worth the trade-off. That assessment is precisely what fascinates and disturbs me about human decision-making, Lyra replied, completing her adjustments and stepping back to study Eris with those large, iridescent eyes. You consistently prioritize external objectives over personal biological integrity. Depending on the stakes, yes, Eris agreed, her voice growing slightly slurred as the powerful Cthar pharmaceuticals took effect. Sometimes the mission matters more than the individual. A concept that exists in Cthar philosophy but is rarely applied to immediate physical risk, Lyra said thoughtfully. Our evolutionary path favored those who preserve themselves to reproduce later rather than risking immediate termination. Different worlds, different survival strategies, Eris murmured, fighting to keep her eyes open. You evolved on a stable planet with predictable dangers. We evolved on a world that tried to kill us in new and exciting ways every other Tuesday. Lyra made a sound that Eris had learned was the Cthar equivalent of surprised laughter, a soft, bubbling trill. Your human idioms remained delightfully puzzling. Her expression grew more serious. Rest now. Your intervention was valuable, but it has set back your recovery by approximately one cycle. Worth it, Eris repeated, finally surrendering to the medication's effects as consciousness slipped away once more. The following days brought a subtle shift in Lyra's approach to Eris's treatment. The Cthar medical officer continued to maintain strict supervision of the healing process, but she began to incorporate more of Eris's suggestions regarding activity levels and mental engagement. Small compromises emerged. A more comprehensive data terminal installed permanently beside the medical platform, permission for brief periods of assisted walking around the medical bay, and most significantly, regular updates from the geological survey team that had taken over Eris's research. Your cellular regeneration has stabilized into more predictable patterns, Lyra noted on the 15th day, scanning Eris's now visible left arm as the human carefully performed the prescribed strengthening exercises. Still not optimal by Cthar standards, but the functionality is returning at an impressive rate. Told you movement would help, Eris replied, rotating her wrist with only minimal discomfort. The limb looked almost normal now, though angry red scars still marked where compound fractures had broken through the skin and the deeper muscle tissue remained visibly atrophied. How soon can I get back to light duty? Instead of the immediate refusal Eris had come to expect, Lyra considered the question seriously, consulting her extensive medical data. Limited laboratory work might be possible within 5 cycles, assuming continued stable progress and strict adherence to activity restrictions. Eris couldn't hide her surprise. That's more reasonable than I expected. I have been researching human medical literature more extensively, Lyra admitted. Your species' medical protocols, while often alarmingly cavalier by our standards, do contain logical elements based on your unique physiology. The concept of physical therapy is particularly interesting, controlled stress application to strengthen healing tissues. Exactly, Eris nodded. We heal better when we keep moving, within reason of course. Complete immobility actually slows recovery from most injuries. A counterintuitive approach that nonetheless appears effective for your species, Lyra acknowledged. She hesitated, then asked, "May I inquire about your previous medical experiences? You referenced working through worse when you first awoke. Was this hyperbole, or have you indeed sustained comparable injuries previously?" Eris chuckled, then winced slightly as the movement pulled at her still-healing ribs. Not quite this bad, but close. During my initial training expedition on Proxima b, I fell into a ravine while collecting mineral samples. Broke my leg in 3 places, dislocated my shoulder, and cracked my helmet. Had to splint the leg with equipment parts and climb out myself. Lyra's facial tendrils vibrated with what might have been horror. Without immediate medical attention, the nearest medical facility was 50 kilometers away, Eris explained. My emergency beacon was damaged in the fall, so I patched myself up, fashioned a crutch from my sampling equipment, and hiked back to base camp. Took about 14 hours. 14 hours of ambulation on a traumatically fractured limb. Lyra's normally pale blue skin darkened to indigo. The pain would have been incapacitating. It wasn't pleasant, Eris acknowledged with a shrug. But the alternative was dying alone in a ravine, so motivation wasn't exactly lacking. And there were no permanent consequences from this. Self-treatment, Lyra asked, scanner hovering nearby, as if she might detect evidence of this past trauma. My right leg is about half a centimeter shorter than my left now, Eris admitted, and it aches when the atmospheric pressure changes dramatically. But otherwise, it healed well enough. Our bones remodel themselves over time. Lyra made a notation on her tablet, head tendrils vibrating in what Eris had come to recognize as intense scientific curiosity. Remarkable adaptive capability, if barbarically implemented. Were there other instances? Over the next hour, Eris shared stories of various injuries and impromptu treatment from her years working on frontier worlds. The broken fingers splinted with writing implements and sealed with equipment epoxy. The laceration closed with emergency adhesive when proper medical supplies ran out. The concussion self-diagnosed and monitored via timed cognitive tests programmed into her personal device. Lyra listened with growing fascination, occasionally interjecting with medical questions or expressions of disbelief at particularly unorthodox treatments. By the end, her tablet was filled with notes, and her large eyes blinked in the asymmetrical pattern that indicated deep thought. Your species' medical history suggests an almost pathological disregard for personal safety in pursuit of objectives, she finally said. Yet paradoxically, this very trait seems to have enhanced your collective survival and technological advancement. Necessity drives innovation, Eris replied simply. And humans have always been good at finding ways to keep going when stopping isn't an option. A quality I am beginning to appreciate, despite its alarming implementation, Lyra admitted. Though I still maintain that your recovery would be more efficient with proper medical protocols, which I'm following more or less, Eris pointed out. I haven't tried to escape the medical bay or perform surgery on myself with spare parts. Small mercies, Lyra replied, with that bubbling trill that passed for Kthar laughter. Though I suspect it's not for lack of consideration. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft alert from the medical bay's communication system. Commander Zoran's voice followed immediately. Medical Officer Lyra, we have a developing situation in the Northern Research Quadrant. The latest seismic event has triggered unexpected geothermal activity near Survey Team 2's position. They're reporting difficulty maintaining communication and have requested immediate consultation with Dr. Thorne regarding safe extraction protocols. Eris was already sitting up straighter, her attention fully engaged. Survey Team 2 is in the Caldera region. If there's increased geothermal activity there, it could indicate an imminent eruption cycle. They need to evacuate immediately. Lyra glanced between Eris and the communication panel, her facial tendrils vibrating with clear concern. The patient is not cleared for duty-related stress, Commander. Perhaps another geological specialist could advise. There isn't time, Eris interrupted, and there's no one else with my specific experience in Xylosian volcanic systems. Put them through, please. Lyra hesitated only briefly before activating the main display. The image that appeared showed a harried-looking human technician, dust covering his environmental suit and background readings flashing urgent warnings. Static interfered with the transmission, breaking his words occasionally. Dr. Thorne, thank God, we've got situation here. Ground temperature has by 30 degrees in the last hour. Sensors are showing magma chamber activity approximately 2 kilometers beneath our position. Standard protocols say evacuate, but the primary route is already steam vents, and not sure if the secondary route will remain stable long enough. Listen carefully, Eris replied, her voice calm and authoritative despite her position in the medical bay. The northern caldera has a predictable eruption pattern, but it's preceded by specific gas emissions. Is your atmospheric analyzer functioning? Yes, but readings don't match any of the standard warning profiles. Look specifically for sulfur dioxide to hydrogen sulfide ratios, Eris instructed. If the SO2 is more than 3 times the H2S level, you're dealing with an imminent magmatic eruption and need immediate evacuation by any means necessary. If the ratio is closer to equal, it's likely just increased hydrothermal activity without magmatic involvement. The technician disappeared briefly from view, presumably checking the relevant instruments. When he returned, his expression was marginally less panicked. So 2/H2S ratio is 1.2 to 1, holding steady for the past 3 readings. Good, Eris nodded. That indicates hydrothermal activity, but not immediate magmatic eruption. Your primary evacuation route is compromised by steam vents, but those are typically localized and temporary. Map their distribution and look for a pattern. They usually form along existing fault lines. For the next 20 minutes, Eris guided the survey team through, analyzing the developing situation and identifying a safe extraction route between the emerging steam vents. Throughout the exchange, she maintained her professional demeanor, despite the visible stress in her posture and the readings on Lyra's medical monitors that showed elevated heart rate and stress hormones. When the team finally confirmed they had reached their transport vehicle and were safely departing the area, Eris exhaled slowly, slumping back against the medical platform. The pain in her healing arm and torso, which she had been effectively ignoring during the crisis, now returned with renewed intensity. Immediate medical intervention required, Lyra announced, already moving to adjust Eris's medication delivery system. Stress levels have compromised the regenerative matrix again. They're safe, Eris said simply, as if that justified any physical setback. And we've gathered valuable data on the predictive indicators for Xylosian geothermal events, at the expense of approximately 0.8 cycles of recovery time, Lyra replied, though her tone lacked the sharp disapproval it might have held days earlier. Your commitment to your colleagues' safety is admirable, if medically counterproductive. Part of the job, Eris murmured, already feeling the effects of the adjusted medication. Can't ask others to take risks, I wouldn't. As Eris drifted into medicated sleep, Lyra remained beside the medical platform, studying the human's readings with a thoughtful expression. After several minutes, she made an entry in her medical log. Human recovery patterns continue to defy standard models. Subject demonstrates capacity to temporarily suppress pain responses and physical limitations during perceived crisis situations. Hormone analysis suggests complex interplay between adrenaline, cortisol, and endorphin release that may actually accelerate certain healing mechanisms despite apparent contradiction of biological energy conservation principles. Further research warranted. The following days brought a subtle but significant shift in the dynamics of Eris's recovery. Lyra implemented a modified treatment protocol that incorporated more elements of human medical approaches, scheduled periods of controlled movement and activity interspersed with intensive regenerative treatments, gradual reduction in pain management medications to allow more natural feedback systems to function, and perhaps most importantly, limited but regular engagement with the outpost's ongoing research and operations. Your recovery metrics have improved by 12% since implementing the hybrid protocol, Lyra noted on the 23rd day, reviewing the comprehensive scans of Eris's now largely healed injuries. The cellular alignment remains suboptimal by Cathar standards, but functionality is returning at a rate that exceeds our most optimistic projections. Eris, now able to sit comfortably in a proper chair beside the medical platform rather than confined to it, flexed her left arm appreciatively. The limb still bore the vivid red scars of its traumatic injury, and certain movements produced twinges of pain, but the improvement was remarkable. Told you the human approach had merit. A qualified merit, Lyra corrected, though her facial tendrils vibrated in what Eris had come to recognize as mild amusement. Your methodology remains alarmingly haphazard by our standards, but I cannot argue with the empirical results. Haphazard but effective is practically our species' motto, Eris replied with a grin. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Commander Zoran, his formal posture indicating an official rather than casual visit. Medical Officer Lyra, Dr. Thorne. I trust the recovery continues to progress satisfactorily. Indeed, Commander, Lyra replied. Dr. Thorne's condition has improved significantly. Limited return to duty may be possible within 3 cycles, assuming continued stable progress. Excellent news, Zoran nodded, his elaborate head tendrils rippling with the movement. I have come to discuss a developing situation that requires both your expertise. He activated a small holographic projector, displaying a 3-dimensional map of the outpost and surrounding terrain. Our long-range sensors have detected a significant pressure buildup in the planetary crust approximately 12 kilometers south of our position. The pattern is concerning. Eris leaned forward, studying the holographic data with immediate interest. That's directly beneath the secondary water reclamation facility. The pressure gradient indicates potential for a major seismic event within. I'd estimate 72 to 96 hours based on previous patterns. Precisely our analysis as well, Zoran confirmed. Chief Engineer Valance has proposed a preemptive pressure relief operation using our deep drilling equipment to create controlled venting points. However, the procedure requires precise geological expertise to determine optimal drilling locations. And you need me to provide that expertise, Eris concluded. She glanced at Lyra, already anticipating the Cathar medical officer's objection. To her surprise, Lyra was studying the holographic data with thoughtful consideration rather than immediate refusal. The patient's physical recovery has reached a point where limited consulting activities may be permissible, provided strict protocols are followed to prevent overexertion. Both Eris and Commander Zoran turned to Lyra with barely concealed surprise. You're clearing me for duty? Eris asked, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. I am clearing you for limited consulting activities, Lyra corrected precisely, to be conducted from the medical bay, with continuous monitoring and subject to immediate termination if your physiological stress indicators exceed established safety parameters. That's remarkably reasonable, Eris admitted. I have been studying human medical literature extensively, Lyra replied, her large eyes blinking in that asymmetrical pattern of deep thought. Your species' approach to recovery, while initially appearing reckless to Cthar sensibilities, contains logical elements when viewed through the lens of your evolutionary history and physiological adaptations. Mental engagement appears to positively influence physical recovery in humans, particularly when the engagement involves problem-solving relevant to the individual's primary purpose. In simple terms, I heal better when I'm doing useful work, Eris translated with a smile. A crude but essentially accurate summation, Lyra acknowledged. Furthermore, the safety of the outpost and its personnel is a priority that transcends individual medical considerations, within reason. If your expertise can prevent a catastrophic seismic event, the benefit outweighs the potential minor setback to your recovery timeline. Commander Zoran's facial tendrils vibrated with what might have been surprise or approval. A most pragmatic assessment, medical officer. I concur with your conditions. He turned to Eris. Dr. Thorne, are you willing to provide the necessary geological consultation under these terms? Absolutely, Eris replied without hesitation. I'll need full access to the sensor data and direct communication with the drilling team, and preferably a more comfortable chair if I'm going to be working for extended periods. For the next 3 days, Eris worked from her modified station in the medical bay, analyzing geological data and directing the precise placement of pressure relief bores around the threatened facility. Lyra maintained her vigilant monitoring, occasionally enforcing rest periods when Eris's readings indicated increasing stress or fatigue, but otherwise allowing the human to work without undue interference. The pressure relief operation proceeded successfully, the potentially catastrophic buildup gradually dissipating through the carefully placed venting points. When the final readings confirmed the immediate danger had passed, there was a palpable sense of relief throughout the outpost. A most effective collaboration, Commander Zoran noted during his visit to review the final data. The pressure has stabilized at manageable levels, and the secondary facility remains fully operational. Your expertise was invaluable, Dr. Thorne. It was good to be useful again, Eris replied simply. She stretched carefully, noting with satisfaction that the movement caused only minimal discomfort in her healing limbs. Though I have to admit, Lyra's hybrid recovery program seems to be working remarkably well. I expected to be more exhausted after 3 days of intensive work. The regulated activity appears to have stimulated your natural recovery mechanisms, Lyra observed, reviewing her scanner readings. Your stress hormone levels have actually stabilized at healthier baseline levels, and cellular regeneration in the affected tissues has accelerated marginally. Does this mean I might be cleared for full duty sooner than anticipated? Eris asked hopefully. Perhaps, Lyra acknowledged, making adjustments to her tablet. Your recovery continues to progress more rapidly than our initial models projected. If current trends continue, limited field work might be possible within 2 cycles rather than 3. I shall update the duty roster accordingly, Commander Zoran said, his tone formal but with that subtle harmonic undertone that Eris had learned indicated Cthar satisfaction. The Northern Basin Survey remains a priority before the storm season arrives. As Zoran departed, Eris turned to Lyra with undisguised curiosity. You've changed your approach quite dramatically since I first woke up in here. What happened to catastrophic injuries and minimum 38 cycles of recovery? Lyra's facial tendrils vibrated in that now familiar pattern of thoughtful consideration. I have been conducting extensive research into human physiology and medical history while monitoring your recovery. The results have been educational. Educational how, exactly? Your species' medical and survival records contain patterns that initially appeared contradictory or even irrational by Cthar standards, Lyra explained, setting aside her scanner to focus fully on the conversation. Individuals with traumatic injuries performing feats that should have been physiologically impossible, recovery rates that defied standard biological models, survival in conditions that would be rapidly fatal to most known sentient species. We're stubborn, Eris said with a shrug. It is more complex than mere stubbornness, Lyra countered. Your evolutionary history shaped biological and neurological systems that respond to crisis in fundamentally different ways than Cathar physiology. Where our systems shut down to preserve essential functions when faced with severe trauma, your systems often activate emergency resources, suppressing pain, redirecting energy, and even temporarily accepting tissue damage to achieve immediate survival objectives. Fight or flight, Eris nodded. Basic human stress response. But it extends beyond immediate crisis response, Lyra continued, her large eyes blinking with intensity. Your ongoing recovery patterns suggest a biological system optimized for adaptation and functionality rather than perfect restoration. Your cells regenerate in patterns that prioritize immediate usefulness over long-term optimization. Your neural pathways reroute around damage rather than waiting for perfect healing. Your psychological framework actively resists inactivity even when conservation would appear logical. We're an impatient species, Eris admitted. Always have been. Impatience that appears to have served your evolutionary development, Lyra observed. I have modified my treatment approaches based on these observations. If your biology responds more positively to controlled stress and activity than to complete rest, then optimal medical care must accommodate those parameters. I appreciate the adaptation, Eris said sincerely. It can't have been easy to adjust your established medical protocols. Scientific advancement requires openness to new data, Lyra replied simply. Though I maintain that many human medical practices remain alarmingly primitive by Cathar standards. No argument there, Eris chuckled. Some of our emergency field techniques probably qualify as medieval torture by your standards. Indeed, Lyra's facial tendrils vibrated in what might have been a shudder. I encountered historical records of human battlefield medicine that would be classified as criminal assault in Cathar jurisdiction. Necessity drives innovation, Eris said with a shrug. Not always pretty innovation, but effective when the alternative is death. A perspective that remains challenging for Cathar sensibilities, Lyra acknowledged. Our evolutionary path favored withdrawal and protection over aggressive adaptation. Injury meant retreat and recovery, not continued function through damage. Different worlds, different survival strategies. Eris repeated her earlier observation. Neither right nor wrong, just adapted to different circumstances. 2 more cycles passed with remarkable progress. Eris graduated from the medical bay to her own quarters, though still under Lyra's strict monitoring regime. The regeneration fields were removed entirely, revealing fully healed, though heavily scarred tissue beneath. Physical therapy exercises became more intensive, focused on rebuilding strength and endurance in the affected limbs. On the 32nd day since the accident, Lyra conducted a comprehensive final assessment in the medical bay. Remarkable, she noted, reviewing the scan results. Bone density has returned to 94% of pre-injury levels. Muscle mass at 89%, and continuing to improve with physical conditioning. Neural pathway reformation is complete, though some sensory perception in the left hand remains slightly diminished. Good enough for field work? Eris asked hopefully, flexing her left arm through its complete range of motion. There was still some stiffness and occasional twinges of pain, but nothing that would significantly impair function. By Cathar standards, you would remain under medical observation for at least another 15 cycles, Lyra replied honestly. However, applying the human medical parameters I have now incorporated into my assessment protocols, yes, you appear fit for limited field duty with appropriate precautions. Eris couldn't contain her grin. That's the best news I've heard in a month. You will maintain regular medical check-ins, Lyra stipulated firmly. Any sign of regression or complications must be reported immediately. And your initial field activities should include a partner to assist with physically demanding tasks. All reasonable conditions, Eris agreed readily. When can I start? I will inform Commander Zoran that you are cleared for limited duty beginning tomorrow's cycle, Lyra said. making the official notation in her medical records. The Northern Basin Survey team has been maintaining the preliminary research in your absence. They will require your expertise to complete the mineral analysis before the storm season arrives. Perfect timing, Eris nodded, already mentally preparing for the work ahead. The preliminary data they've collected shows promising indications of the rare earth deposits we've been searching for. As Eris prepared to leave the medical bay, Lyra approached with an unusual hesitation in her normally precise movements. There is one additional matter, Dr. Thorne. Please, after a month of putting me back together, I think you can call me Eris, she replied with a smile. Eris, Lyra acknowledged with a slight dip of her head tendrils. I wish to express appreciation for the educational opportunity your recovery has provided. My understanding of human physiology and adaptive capabilities has expanded significantly through this process. Happy to provide a learning experience, though I'd prefer less painful methods in the future, Eris joked. Indeed, Lyra's facial tendrils vibrated in that now familiar pattern of Cthar amusement. I have updated our medical protocols for human patients based on these observations. Future treatment regimens will incorporate appropriate activity levels and stress management rather than the complete immobility previously prescribed. That'll make any future human patients much happier, Eris assured her. We're terrible at doing nothing. So, I have observed, Lyra agreed. There is one aspect of your recovery that continues to fascinate me. However, your initial response to catastrophic injury, it's hardly bleeding, represents a psychological pattern that appears consistently in human medical records but remains largely alien to Cthar understanding. Understatement in the face of crisis? Eris suggested. It's a human coping mechanism. Acknowledging the full extent of an injury can be paralyzing, so we compartmentalize, focus on what needs to be done rather than how badly we're hurt. A remarkable psychological adaptation, Lyra noted. In Cthar medicine, accurate assessment and acknowledgement of damage is considered essential to proper treatment. To deliberately minimize or understate trauma would be considered dangerously counterproductive. Different approaches for different physiologies, Eris said with a shrug. For us, sometimes the mind needs to trick the body into continuing function beyond what should be possible. It served us well as a species, even if it occasionally drives our medical professionals to distraction. A sentiment I now fully appreciate, Lyra replied, with another vibration of her facial tendrils that Eris had come to recognize as genuine amusement. I shall endeavor to develop appropriate translation matrices between human psychological responses and actual medical conditions for future reference. Good luck with that, Eris laughed. We're notoriously inconsistent. The following morning, Eris reported to the Northern Basin Survey team, environmental suit modified to accommodate her still strengthening left arm and the monitoring devices Lyra had insisted upon. As she stepped into the transport vehicle that would take them to the research site, she caught sight of Lyra watching from the medical facility entrance. The Cthar medical officer raised one six-fingered hand in what Eris recognized as an adopted human gesture of farewell. Eris returned the wave with a grin before boarding the vehicle. As the transport departed, Lyra returned to her laboratory and made one final entry in her research log. Human resilience remains a profound biological and psychological enigma by Cthar standards, yet its effectiveness cannot be disputed. The capacity to maintain function despite severe physical compromise, to prioritize external objectives over personal biological integrity, and to utilize controlled stress as a recovery mechanism represents an evolutionary path distinctly different from our own. While the human approach continues to appear alarmingly reckless in many respects, I must acknowledge its adaptive value in crisis situations. The phrase, "it's hardly bleeding," perhaps best encapsulates this remarkable disparity, a statement that would be an egregious medical falsehood by Cthar standards, yet served as an effective psychological tool for the human patient. Our species may never fully reconcile our fundamentally different approaches to physical trauma, but through continued observation and adaptation, we may develop medical protocols that honor both perspectives. In this particular case, I must concede that the human methodology, while chaotic and counterintuitive, achieved recovery rates that exceeded our most optimistic projections. A humbling but valuable lesson in xenobiological diversity.